Hello, everybody, and welcome to Do Your Research. I'm Michael.
And I'm Carl.
And this is a podcast.
That it is.
Carl,
Michael?
did you know that they have earthquakes on the moon?
Well, I mean, they don't have earthquakes on the moon.
Well, of course, yes.
Moonquakes on the moon.
They're not technically earthquakes because we're not technically talking about the Earth, but the moon itself has its own quakes.
They also are caused by different things, because the moon doesn't have, like, a molten core or tectonic plates.
You could have just said, yes, you already knew that.
Sorry. Yeah, I did, actually.
You're gonna be a smart guy about it. I was so excited when I found that. I was like, "What, moonquakes? That's an awesome band name."
Aren't they caused by gravity?
Yeah, there's a couple different potential causes for them. Gravity is one of them. There's, what do they call it? Like some sort of like tidal events because it's locked.
It's tidally locked to the Earth.
Yeah, tidally locked to the Earth, and so there are some moonquakes that are caused by that and disruptions because of that. Also, meteorite impact vibrations and thermal moonquakes when the sun heats up one side. Anyway,
But
I thought
still,
that was a fun and interesting fact that you already knew apparently. So
that is a fun and interesting fact, though.
well, the thing that really drove me to that fact is going to be the topic that we're going to be discussing today.
The topic we're going to be discussing today?
Yes, is related to the moon. In fact, today we're going to be discussing. Actually, you know what? I want to do this because we have this opportunity here. We're changing up our format slightly and doing this in a really fun way. I want to pay homage to a great podcast that we both like and listen to called Knowledge Fight that inspired a lot of the format of this podcast. So I want to do in honor of those guys a little super in context drop for the topic we're going to be talking about today.
Ooh, exciting.
There was an old saying in NASA, if you can't make it, fake it.
Mm-hmm. There's an old saying in NASA.
Old saying in NASA, huh? Was that invented in NASA around the same time Donald Trump invented the phrase "prime the pump"?
I don't know what that's in reference to.
Donald Trump claimed to invent the phrase "prime the pump" early in his presidency.
Oh my God, that's stupid. I didn't hear about that.
Well, I mean, amongst the things that he did, that's petty and small, but still representative, so that's understandable.
Yeah, that is petty. Yeah, so you might know that NASA, that's not a motto that they're known for, but you might be able to guess based on that sound effect what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So today we are going to do something a little bit different. Our last few podcasts, we've sort of moved to the format of we have a firm outline that we're both aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And today, Michael, you are going to take me and our listener on a bit of a journey through the wonderful world of people who don't believe we went to the moon.
Yes, people who don't believe we went to the moon, and specifically one specific person that believes that we didn't go to the moon. While we were researching this and setting this up, I happened to stumble across a just amazing piece of audio gold. It's a conversation that occurred 1,000 years ago, back in 1996, over the airwaves of CITR 102 FM in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And it's a conversation between author and scientist Bill Kaysing, the father of the moon landing hoax conspiracy theories and the author of We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion swindle. A conversation between him and a funny little radio disc jockey fella who calls himself Nardwar the Human Serviette.
Which, and Michael had to tell me this, for our listeners that don't know, a serviette is a fancy napkin. So he calls himself the Human Napkin.
Human Napkin.
Also, I do want to note, as a departure from normal, so for a little bit of the behind the scenes on how we do this, usually Michael and I have a few planning sessions, and normally going into this, while we don't know how things are going to be phrased, we know what the topics are that each person is going to cover. Sometimes we have a little more or less obfuscation about what the exact details are for the purposes of reaction. This time, Michael painstakingly went through this, what I assume will be an amazing interview, because I haven't heard but a few seconds of clips for testing purposes and that drop, and he just gave me a few specific topics to try and refute, which I then just looked up those things, but tried to avoid information about these two fine fellows.
Yes. One of them more fine than the other one, I will say. I'll let you determine for yourself which one I'm talking about by the end of this.
I'm already figuring the serviette is probably going to be finer than the crazy conspiracy theorist. But
well, you're letting your bias show there, Carl.
Yep,
Yep.
that's true. That's
So-
a statement of fact.
We're going to go on a ride today. But first, before we do this, I want to talk to you a little bit about this guy because holy moly, what a character of a person. I have never heard of this guy before. He is not unknown. He is on a rather big major city radio station. He has over like 500,000 followers on Facebook. So, not too bad, but he's done interviews with hundreds of people over the years.
We're talking about Nardwuar?
We're talking about Nardwuar, the human serviette. He has done.
Wow.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about him. So his real name is John Ruskin. He was born July 5th, 1968, and as we mentioned before, he calls himself Nardwuar, the human serviette, or simply Nardwuar for short. He is Canadian, as we mentioned. He is the lead singer and keyboardist for a band called the Evaporators. And he is just about the nerdiest, geekiest looking person I think I've ever seen in my entire life. He has a very unique and very strange and intense interview style, asking very, very strange and wacky, but also very poignant and sometimes very intelligent interview questions. He's interviewed artists and musicians such as Snoop Dogg, Weird Al Yankovic, Nirvana, Marilyn Manson, Eric Andre, Wu-Tang Clan, The Strokes, Jay-Z. I mean, this guy is not small potatoes. He's been around the block. And 1996, let's see, how old would he have been at that point? He would have been 28. I think that's right. He was born in 68.
52.
Mm-hmm. So in 96.
So yeah, like 28.
28. All right.
Yeah.
So he's 28 at the time that he interviewed Bill Casing. And I won't talk too much about Bill. We'll get into his background a little bit more as we go through this episode. But are you ready to get started with this, buddy?
I am. I'm looking at pictures of Nardwuar now, though, and
Okay.
just like he does appear to be just quite the character. And he's interviewed everyone from Post Malone to ICP to apparently moon landing deniers.
Mm-hmm. So let's go ahead and listen to his first introduction with Bill Casing, and we'll have Bill Casing explain a little bit about who he is.
Well, I'm an alternatives lifestyle writer. I've written about 20 books on how to live outside of what I call the corporate imperatives. In other words, how to live very cheaply, how to not get caught in the rat race.
Your name is Bill Casing.
Yeah, I've written a number of books. There should be more in the Vancouver Library.
All right, his name is Bill Casing.
So, Bill Casing, are you saying, Bill Casing, author of We Never Went to the Moon, and we're speaking here to Bill Casing, author of We Never Went to the Moon, and there was nobody that ever landed on the moon, right, Bill?
That is absolutely correct. I will stake my life on it.
And all right,
So yeah, all right. Bill
Strong-
Casing denies the entirety of the Apollo program,
yes, the entirety of the
or at
Apollo
least the
program.
parts that landed on the moon.
Yeah, he denies pretty much most of it. Spoilers, you'll find out. And you could tell Nardwuar. I just oh man. Well, as soon as I heard his voice in the interview, I was like, oh, we've got to do this. I love this. So Bill Casing, a self-described author and lifestyle writer, who's written about 20 books up into that point in 96. He has had a really big impact on the moon landing conspiracy theory hoax. And there's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that he is not, if not the first person to really capitalize and push this theory, he's the first one to ever write a book about it and go on and talk about it and really inspire others to do the same.
So, if not the originator of many of the primary conspiracy topics that deny the moon landing,
Mm-hmm.
definitely the first aggregator, the first solidify the narratives. First to
Yep.
solidify the narratives. Okay.
Yep. In his book, We Never Went to the Moon, America's
Yeah.
$30 billion swindle.
This is not just some random, like, well, he is a random kook, but he's not just some, like, small potatoes random kook that we just pulled out of a hat. He's
No,
one
exactly.
of the big boys of denying the moon.
He definitely is. And he wrote that book back in 1976, which is, as you can do the math, 7 years after the Apollo moon landing, and 20 years before this interview takes place. And in that time, he's inspired a lot of other people, and really we started seeing this big upward spike in moon landing hoax beliefs around the 1990s. And we had people like Ralph Renee who came in, and he wrote a book I think called How NASA Mooned America, which is another moon landing hoax.
I love the titles.
It's great, right? And let's listen to Bill talk about the people he inspired, specifically Ralph Renee.
There's a new book out, NASA Mooned America.
Yes, that's by a man named Ralph Renee, who lives in Passaic, New Jersey, and the book is very well done. It's far superior to my book because Renee is essentially a self-taught engineer.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm. Started strong and ended a little bit on the flop side.
Yeah, it's better than mine because he's a self-taught engineer.
Engineer, yeah.
Not that there aren't some people who have been self-taught and been amazing at many things.
Right.
Not necessarily qualified to debunk the work of some of the greatest luminaries of their day who put us on the
moon. They might see things a little bit differently than you, Carl.
And the decades of research that led up to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, all of that smart guy stuff aside, we will totally get to that. But this is one of those first points where I I titled this clip Nardwuar is a huge nerd. And I just want to play this in response to speaking about Ralph Renee.
Okay. This is Renee. He calls astronauts astronauts, which is very interesting. That's kind of funny. Astronauts, like they're not astronaut. That's very interesting.
Yes, that is true. He has a good comic sense.
This is
Does he though? Does he?
This is what passes for comedy in 1996.
Did it?
Conspiracy theory circles. I don't know.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right. In this conspiracy circle, I will clearly give you that.
Don't you think that's funny, Carl? Astronaut.
Yeah, I mean, the pun is like one of the oldest forms of humor, and that's a pretty... That's not a top tier pun there, so...
It's classic. That's how you know you got to take these conspiracy people seriously, Carl, because of the level of pun technique in their work. They're able to be scientific and fun about it.
I mean, Catch-22 alone was written in 1953.
Is that a book about puns?
It's almost entirely puns. Yes.
Wait, the book Catch-22 is...
Oh, it's chock full. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know this.
You need to read Catch-22. It's hilarious.
Apparently I did. Am I thinking Catcher in the Rye? I was like,
You're probably thinking of Catcher in the Rye.
I don't remember that book having a lot of puns.
That is not chock full of puns, no.
Very
different books.
Yes. No, very few. I don't remember a single one.
Yeah.
A little bit different subject matter.
It's the one about killing Lenin.
Well, yeah.
Ooh, too soon? Was that too soon?
That might have been a little too soon.
Okay.
And slightly off topic, because you might be asking yourself, well, Bill says that the moon landing was fake, right? Keep in mind that we've had multiple moon landings, not just the one by this point. But what does Bill think about other space flights?
Well, do you believe that rockets ever made orbit? Like, did Surveyor or Pioneer actually happen?
Possibly not. I'm not absolutely certain about that. I will concede that certain unmanned vehicles might have made it to the moon. The Russians are supposed to have sent some unmanned vehicles to the moon, and possibly our Surveyor did land on the moon, but units with people in them, never.
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly rockets have made it to space. Yes, possibly this thing that has been witnessed by amateur astronomers the world over, who I guess are also involved in the conspiracy.
Yeah, exactly. All of them are in on it. And so, and what do you say about other men or astronauts or people in space.
How about in the actual atmosphere, like John Glenn in space, Yuri Gagarin? Were they actually in space?
I doubt it.
Nope. All right. Well, there you go.
All right. Short, sweet, to the point. I will give him that succinctness seems to be a strong suit of his.
He has a few of those little one-liners in this that we'll get to, and some that I just absolutely love. But that's a basic intro to Bill Casing for now. You can get a little bit of the speed of the man and kind of what he's all about. In this next clip, we're going to get started to look at the specific points that Bill is making in this interview, and you are going to use your big smart guy brain and help us make sense as to why the stuff coming out of Bill's mouth is nonsense. So I'm going to recap the official government stance on the moon landing and what Bill
that
thinks
it occurred.
Yeah, that it happened. But Bill's got a different opinion.
What is the actual government stance on the moon landing, Bill Casing?
Okay, the government claims that the reports of astronauts and photographs and some rocks prove that we went to the moon. And my feeling is that some photos and some people who have been under military pay or military jurisdiction all their lives and some rocks don't prove a thing. In fact, there is so much contrary evidence to going to the moon, such as solar and cosmic radiation, micrometeorites, the temperature on the moon, the fact that the astronauts never reported how magnificent the stars were, or they never showed a picture of the crater that should have been dug underneath the lunar lander. It goes on and on. I have hundreds of pieces of information that any really intelligent person could review and then decide for themselves.
We did.
Yeah, we'll take you up on that, Bill. We'll take you up on that real good, buddy. All right. So Bill's first point is one that we affectionately titled, "It's Not Full of Stars." So that point that Bill made there about the astronauts not making any reference to how pretty all the stars were, and the images that came back from the camera stills not having any stars in them visible from the lunar surface. So I'm going to go ahead and play the intro for that.
In your book, you mentioned that there were no stars in the photos that NASA took.
That's right, and they had the most marvelous opportunity to take pictures of all the stars in the universe visible from the moon. I've talked to a number of top-level astronauts, both locally and elsewhere, and they say that the astronauts would have been overwhelmed by the sight of trillions of stars, not to mention Jupiter and Saturn and the other planets and so forth, but not one picture has ever come back from the alleged trip to the moon showing the stars in all their magnificence, nor do any of the astronauts comment on the stars. They completely ignore it. It would be like going to Niagara Falls and talking about the hamburger you ate.
So what do you think about that, Carl?
Well, so I'm going to cover very briefly the astronauts not talking about it claim. Now, I will admit, I forgot to research that. So just now, while that was playing, I just went ahead and Googled Apollo astronauts talk about stars. And I found multiple interviews, and I've included a clip in our document, which we'll share, of specifically the Apollo 8 astronauts. And from the clip, from the text of what I read, they talked about the moon swallowing stars as it slowly rotated. So, false.
All right.
Apollo astronauts did talk about the stars. They just did. That is a fact. Now, I'm sure Bill would say, well, we can't trust them, because he already said people under government payroll, you can't trust them. So then let's look at the photographic. His claim that the lack of photographic evidence of starscapes, and his claim that they had this wonderful opportunity to take photos of stars. They didn't, actually. Because, well, all right, the biggest challenge to sending things into space is weight and thrust. Every single ounce matters. Everything is purpose-built. We do not send up things that are not built to purpose, and that includes the cameras. The cameras used for observation in space missions are purpose-built for their specific mission. They do not actually have adjustable apertures, for example. For those not familiar with photography, that is adjusting how much your shutter opens and how much light then hits the film, or in the case of modern cameras, the digital sensor at the back to create the image. So space cameras do not have adjustable apertures. They are designed very specifically for specific ranges of light levels. As an example, the OSIRIS-REx probe, which is much more recent than the moon landing. That was a satellite probe we sent out to land on and photograph an asteroid. That camera on the OSIRIS-REx probe had an aperture set, as I would think the listeners could imagine. It's very dark on asteroids far away from the sun, and photographing the surface of an asteroid is very dark. So it had a very, very, very small aperture, and it needed very, very little light. There's a very famous picture, though, of Earth as OSIRIS flew past. So when I say that when it's on the asteroid, it couldn't turn the camera at Earth, it would wash out the images, you might go, but there are photographs of Earth. Well, that was actually accomplished by taking 3 separate shots that lasted milliseconds. One shifted into the red, green, and blue spectrum, and then merging those images together to create a picture of the Earth. And because it had to go so quickly. So that's just an example of a space camera and some of the challenges when you're photographing the non-intended subject matter. It was accomplishable on OSIRIS-REx, but that is a modern space probe, not landing on the moon in 1969, where they were using film cameras, where those cameras were made to photograph the surface of the moon, which, I don't know if you know this, is pretty bright, right?
Yeah,
That's
especially when
why
the
we
sun's
can
on it.
see it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Spacesuits, which are also bright and reflective so as to reflect solar radiation, and spacecraft, which are bright and reflective so as to reflect solar radiation, and just general surface features and those photos of rocks that he mentioned on the moon. That is what the cameras were for. And actually to get photos of like the Earth behind everybody for the big picturesque propaganda photos, frankly, the big mission photos. The Earth is very bright because the sun's bouncing off it. The moon is very bright because the sun is bouncing off it. The spacesuits are very bright because the sun's bouncing off them. And the spaceship is very bright because the sun's bouncing off it and has foil that we'll talk more about later on. That means that those cameras, when you have film, stars in comparison are not very bright at all. They're actually very dim. Anyone who has ever tried to take a photo of the moon, even with a modern camera with an adjustable aperture, will know you have to sit there with the camera in a very, very dark place and expose your image for quite a long time in photographic terms to get any kind of picture of stars. And that camera could not have done that. So his statement, they had this opportunity to get these great photos of stars. They didn't, because that's not what the camera was made for. There's no stars in the photograph behind them, above the moon. Well, of course not, because that's not how film works. The light from the Earth, the light from the surface of the moon, the light from the spacesuits, etc., so beyond washed out the dim light of stars, hundreds to millions to billions of light years away. So that is not a compelling argument at all. Whether it's his argument that they didn't talk about it, they did, or his argument that there should have been stars in the pictures, that makes no sense. Of course there weren't. That's not how film functions. That does not at all, in any way, shape, or form, disprove that they landed on the moon.
This sounded pretty definitive, Carl. Have you thought that maybe perhaps you just can't see stars in space?
I'm willing to dismiss that hypothesis out of hand, yes.
All right, fair enough.
I mean, he is right that with your eyes, with a long exposure camera, if there were variable cameras, if weight didn't matter and we could bring other things up. Example, our stellar or observatories that we have in orbit that take photographs of other galaxies. It is very possible, and without the interference of the Earth's atmosphere, I'm sure, as they talked about in interviews, the view was probably beyond spectacular, jaw-droppingly amazing, which is why they talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't make it possible to capture with the film equipment that we sent up at the time.
Yeah. And it also could be that these men were professionals and they had a lot of work to do. They weren't just sitting around going for a ride. They were constantly testing instruments, running simulations. Like they had shit to do.
One small step for man, one giant step for holy shit, this is gorgeous. I mean, mankind, shit.
Damn it, I
Take
fucked up the
two.
line. All right, Buzz, we got to go back up again. Bring the lunar module back down so we can do this part again.
So yeah, that's just that's just not proof. That is not compelling proof in any way, shape, or form that we didn't land on the moon.
Well, our boy Nardwar also has some similar thoughts that he shares with Bill Casing in this. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts as well. Let's see what Bill has to say about all this.
Doesn't NASA say that the reason that there were no stars is because their cameras weren't set for the proper exposure? Isn't that their line?
That's their line, and that's pure baloney, because I've talked to photographic experts who say that NASA had all the money in the world to have a camera that would have taken magnificent pictures of stars. But there's a little problem. You know, the temperature on the moon is 250 degrees Fahrenheit during the lunar day, and a friend of mine put some film in an oven and ran it up to 250, and the film just curled up. So it's obvious that the pictures that they brought back were not taken on the moon, nor could they have actually taken any pictures on the moon,
brilliant.
even if they had gone there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. All right. I got this one too.
Well,
okay.
I was gonna say we do that's a little preview to one of the other sections. It's too hot on the moon.
But insulation.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it at that for now.
Maybe
insulation.
we'll table that for now.
But in his point too, they had all the money in the world to send whatever camera they want. They did. They had all the money they could they wanted to get us to the moon.
Yeah.
But not all the weight. And sending up an extra camera designed to photograph the stars when they were there to photograph the moon was just not in the weight budget. That just was not in the weight budget. When you're building a space camera, you don't just take an old Olympus film camera and strap it to the front of a spacesuit. You purpose build the thing to take pictures of the weird freaking lighting conditions that we have on the moon. And that does not include pointing the camera up in the sky to take pictures of stars. It just was not a mission priority. I guess they didn't decide to account for crazy skeptics denying objective reality.
I guess they didn't. If they had known this would have really taken off, they would have brought an extra camera. But
also, I'm sorry, but if you're a moon skeptic and you're going to pretend this is all fake anyway, why wouldn't they just poke holes in the backdrop to make stars? I mean, come on.
We might talk about that a little bit later, Carl. Maybe hold on to that thought. And
if you think they couldn't move it, they could just they've had moving backdrops in plays since Shakespeare. I mean, come on.
Mm-hmm. I think we might be talking a little bit more about that pretty soon, buddy.
Okay.
Well, all right.
Sorry.
I would say your explanation was a little bit more convincing, so I'm going to give a point to you. So Carl 1, Bill Casing 0.
Conspiracy guy 0.
Let's move on to counterpoint 2. This one has to do with radiation in space and the Van Allen belt.
Oh, this one
Outer
was
space is no picnic. You've got the Van Allen belt around the Earth, about 20 miles up. The Van Allen belt would probably have cooked any astronauts that ventured into that area.
Yeah. All right. So it would have cooked them. So you might ask yourself, well, how did NASA know about all this? What was the proof that they had to find out that they couldn't make it up through that space radiation?
When did NASA realize that it was impossible for them to send somebody to the moon and they were going to have to fake the moon landing? At what point did they realize this?
Well, initially they realized it in 1959 when I was privy to a study made by the Russians. The Russians discovered that the radiation on the moon would require astronauts to be clothed in 4 feet of lead to avoid being killed.
Oh, 4 feet of lead, Carl. That seems like a
4
lot of lead.
feet of that is a lot of lead.
Be a heavy,
I mean,
heavy
in
space.
fairness, if that were necessary, we probably wouldn't have been able to get it into space to go to the moon.
That'd be talk about weight. That would be a
Yeah.
heavy payload. Yeah, 4 feet of lead. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Carl?
Okay, well, I have some info both on the surface and the Van Allen belt. Where should I start?
Let's start with the Van Allen belt.
Okay. He is very seriously overstating the danger. Not necessarily the levels. Like, if I got flung into space right now, just me in my Eagles t-shirt and pajama bottoms, I would have a problem with the radiation. Now, I would have a problem first with the vacuum, cold, and other things would kill me before the radiation. But it is true.
All of your blood and bodily fluids boiling because of the bends. Yeah.
Yeah. The not explosive decompression, because that's not real. But I would freeze and die. But I would also have problems with radiation if somehow I didn't. But he's overstating, it's the type of radiation. It is ionizing radiation. As we talked about in our 5G episode, you have regular radiation and ionizing radiation. Unlike 5G towers, the Van Allen belt radiation is definitely ionizing radiation. 100%, absolutely. There's parts of it that are quite energetic, especially when we talk relative to the surface of the Earth. Well, relative to what we're comfortable exposing people to over long terms on the surface of the Earth. Not actually in objective relative to the Earth. But the Van Allen belt also has multiple belts of radiation. It's more radioactive towards the poles, less so at the equator. It gets less radioactive as you move out from the Earth. The inner belt, what is closer to the Earth, which ranges from about 1,000 to 12,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth.
Okay.
Because, we're now talking space terms, so that's baby distance, right? I mean, it's pretty radioactive. It is about 100 kilo electron volts around the equator and about 100 mega electron volts at the poles. Now, keen listeners will note I didn't use rads or sieverts. That's because this is a type of radiation that we talk about, the proton energy. Radiation's complicated, basically. And that's quite a bit more than you would ever encounter under any kind of normal circumstance on the surface of the Earth. But it's also not that hard to shield from. About 3 mega electron volts, which is what the average would be on their orbital path, or exit path, the insertion path into the moon's orbit. Yeah. As I mentioned, the radiation is kind of in strips, right? It changes, it varies as you go out. Well, they just plotted a course that would take them not through the worst parts. The 3 mega electron volts, which is about 30 times the equatorial energy, which is where they were going to pass through the main portion of the belt anyway, only takes 6 millimeters of aluminum to block.
Really?
That will stop all of the energetic particles as measured by 3 mega electron volts.
So not 4 feet of lead.
No.
6 millimeters of aluminum.
Yes. The 100 mega electron volts, the highest, most energetic particles measured in the Van Allen belt, can be stopped by 40 millimeters of shielding.
40 millimeters.
Yes. The shielding on the Apollo 11 capsule was 1.27 to 5.08 centimeters, which is a lot more than 40 millimeters. Plus the instrumentation, the equipment, the electronics, the nozzles for the various rockets and gas and everything, all of that also blocks these energetic particles. So he is just very severely overstating the danger of these types of energetic particles. Would you want to just float around in like a flight suit, even sealed for oxygen and temperature, but not shielded in any way, shape, or form for radiation around the polar part of the Van Allen belt? No! No, that would be a bad place to hang out. But inside of even just a moderately designed spacecraft, honestly, I would imagine in all likelihood you're going to exceed the shielding requirement just by building the spaceship. That's not going to take a lot in terms of like intentional design, but there was intentional design, and they specifically designed aluminum shielding around the capsule to avoid this being a problem, because, as he mentioned, we've known about the Van Allen belt since 1958, not because of some, as far as I can tell, Russian study, but because of physics and observation. It's not secret knowledge. It's just knowledge. So, yeah, they just could account for that. So, Van Allen belt, not really that much of a danger. The surface of the moon, though, you might say, well, wouldn't that be more radioactive, right? No atmosphere, constant bombardment from the sun. Surely it's more radioactive than the surface of the Earth.
One would think.
And it is. The surface of the moon, you actually take about 200 to 1,000 times more radiation than you do on the surface of the Earth at sea level. The thing is, that's still nothing. If that weren't nothing, we would all get cancer by the time we died and die of radiation poisoning by the time we were like 15, right? Because it's only 60 microsieverts per hour. It's actually only about 5 or 10 times the rate that you absorb radiation on a transatlantic flight.
Wait, so you're telling me when I'm flying over the Atlantic Ocean, I'm being irradiated?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Or if you climb a mountain, or actually just when you go outside, technically. It's just very little. In fact, it's so little that we even measured, we do not have the dosimeters that they put up with the Apollo missions. A dosimeter is a device that measures radiation exposure. Did not measure rates, they just measured total. So the skin dose rads in the Apollo 11 mission was actually only 0.18 rads. Apollo 14 had the highest exposure. Theirs was also only 1.14 rads. For reference, you get a rad when you get a CT scan.
Okay.
So over the duration of the entirety of the mission, only Apollo 14 exceeded that, and most of them, the second highest was Apollo 12 at 0.58 rads, and it just goes down from there. In fact, long-lasting damage from rad exposure is more in the range of 1 to 200 rads over the course of an entire day. And again, these guys only were exposed to like Apollo 14 the most at 1.14 for the entirety of the mission duration. You can start to see blood changes at around 25 rads, but it's unlikely that that's going to produce any kind of long-term damage. It's just going to filter out. That's what our kidneys and stuff are for. So, again, he's just seriously overstating the average radiation exposure. Now, interestingly, and so I did as a side diversion find, there is a thing that is about as dangerous as he's talking about. Folks who enjoy looking into various stellar apocalypses may be familiar with cosmic gamma ray bursts. These are bursts of radiation that come from nearby supernovas. Well, actually, not even nearby. If one of those had shown up, or actually, we at the time when we were landing on the moon, we weren't observing the sun as closely as we are now, and there could have been stellar cosmic rays given off from the sun if the sun had entered a very active period while our astronauts were up there that could have been very problematic for them. We do now watch that, so when we go back to the moon, it's very easy to prepare for because you just see it's coming, you go inside. But had that happened while the Apollo astronauts were on the moon, it would have been bad. Or had a cosmic ray burst hit. In fact, a gamma ray burst could kill the Earth through the atmosphere, so it definitely could kill the astronauts on the moon. Actually, it is so radioactive, and there are so many energetic particles that even if you tried to shield yourself with lead, you basically need to be under, I think it's about like 20 meters. 10 to 20 meters of shielding would be required. 4 feet of lead would actually just be so dense that it would be even worse because there's so much ionizing radiation pulling through that's just more ionized and energized particles hitting you because you don't have enough shielding. So,
Jesus.
like, there are things in space that are as radioactive as he's describing, but they are very rare, and had they occurred when we were on the moon, we would know because
Mhm.
they'd have died.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's just he is very, 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 very seriously overstating how radioactive all this is. And all of these sources, by the way, other than Osiris Rex, which I just cited as a example of a camera, everything I've talked about here, we knew about in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
Most of the stuff with the Van Allen belt. Well, obviously we didn't know the cumulative radiation exposure of Apollo 17 until Apollo 17 landed and we looked at the dosimeter. But
Right.
like, no, he is, as often we've seen when we've looked into these conspiracies and people talk about radiation, he, like them, is very seriously overstating how radioactive it is, and thus the danger faced or the type of radiation that they're facing. That just simply does not disprove the moon landing. Now, admittedly, I'm using data provided by space missions, which he doesn't believe exist,
Mhm.
so I doubt he would find this compelling, but I don't care.
Yeah.
So,
Carl,
you know,
I think you've made your point well enough. And I think his
uh,
reference to a cryptic 1959 Russian study that was supposedly secret, I guess, because I looked for this thing and I couldn't find it.
I don't get that at all either, because, like, yeah, like, Fishbowl was a secret, right?
Right. Mhm.
For a while, we didn't want to tell everybody what all we did.
Yeah.
But, like, all the other major powers knew we set off nukes in space. You can't
Mhm.
hide that.
Hard to hide.
The physicist who discovered the Van Allen belt was just a regular scientist, so his work was published. It wasn't classified, it was
Mhm.
published. So I don't know why he even thinks there's a secret study that's necessary. We're the ones who set the bombs off in space.
Well, speaking of dropping bombs, I don't know. That
This is
was
an excellent
I
transition.
I really tried to transition to that,
High
but
five.
yeah. Bombs leave a big crater in the ground. Yeah, damn it. I fucked this up because I still had one more point to throw back to this on the subject of moon radiation, specifically about this Russian study that he's referencing. Our boy Nardwar is a little bit more skeptical than maybe some of Bill Casing's other interviewees, and so he asks him a little bit about this.
To be fair, me too.
And Russia did a study in about 59, and this is what the U.S. picked up on. When the U.S. realized in 59 they couldn't go to the moon because the radiation was so bad.
That's right.
Is there any background for this, or is there any records that prove this about the radiation out there in space?
Well, I think any good astrophysicist could give you all the data because it's been pretty well documented by studies. It's not hard to find basic information
It's
on
really hard to find
flights
this
in outer space. And what you come across when you do investigate it is how hostile the universe really is once you leave the Earth's protective atmosphere.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it
not
is.
wrong.
That's yeah. I don't want to. Despite my stating that he has severely overstated the objective dangers of the radiation, if we wanted to establish any kind of like a long-term presence on the moon, more than just the few days that the astronauts were there,
Yeah.
these would be amounts of radiation that we would need to account for. We would need to have structures or underground bases that accounted for the possibility of solar storms. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he is not wrong that these things are dangerous. He's not wrong that they had to plan around the Van Allen belt. He's just wrong about how dangerous it is over the term that these missions last. Like, you see that a lot, though, when conspiracy theorists talk about radiation. And I think it's because there's too much in pop culture about getting exposed to toxic ooze and getting superpowers. Radiation is amount of exposure over what period of time, not like potential exposure if you lived there, if you don't live there.
Exactly. I mean, he's not wrong that it's a hostile place outside of our
There's
atmosphere.
no atmosphere.
Yeah.
We evolved on Earth in 1G. As soon as we leave 1G, like, our organs stop working right. Our muscles don't work right. Blood doesn't work right. Like, everything about us, we grew up in a 1G atmosphere and evolved over millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years to exist here. Everything else is extraordinarily hostile.
Yeah. Very true. That's why we ended up here and evolved in this little blue dot.
It's also why when we went to the moon, we made a little capsule of Earth and took it with us.
That's right. So I'm going to go ahead and give that one to you too, Carl. I think you were a little bit more convincing than our friend Bill Casing. I think if Nardwar were here, he would agree.
Boom! 2-0.
2-0. All right, Carl, but what about this lunar lander crater? Let's talk a little bit about that.
There was no crater beneath the lunar lander. What's
Right.
the significance of that?
Well, the significance is that the lunar lander engine developed 10,000 pounds of thrust, and I've seen many, many rocket engines of that capability in action, and they are so powerful they will move giant rocks across the canyon.
What?
A 10,000-pound thrust engine would have dug a hole right down to bedrock, and it would have stirred up an enormous cloud of dust, and that never appeared in any of the so-called films that they took of the lunar lander. So the crater, the absence of the crater in any photograph of Apollo lunar landers is actually probably the only real proof that you need. You don't need much beyond that and the fact that there weren't any stars.
Okay. I'm going to need some more proof, actually. So, I'm so glad I hadn't heard this before, because I love that statement. I've seen lots of 10,000-pound thrust. Now, the fact is, he probably has, because most of us by 1996 had, because 10,000 pounds is not a lot of thrust. Actually, he's claiming rocket engines. The rockets on Apollo 9 through 17 had 1.5 billion pounds of thrust. So
that's a little more than 10,000, Carl.
Yeah. Okay. So the lunar lander, he is correct. It was about 10,000 pounds of thrust. But yeah, that's just not much. That's not dig a crater to bedrock, because if it were, the 1.5 million pounds of thrust on the rockets would annihilate the landing platform. That's even dumber than I thought. Okay. All right. The lander itself weighs about 33,000 pounds on Earth. On the moon, it only weighs about 16.5% of that, so around 5,500 pounds. The lunar lander actually has less thrust than a Harrier jet. You can find the videos of the many tests they did of the lunar lander engine on Earth. They don't make craters. It doesn't make a crater on Earth. And okay, so the moon has lower gravity, sure, but the 45,000 newtons of descent on thrust, 15,000 on ascent, 45,000 on descent was variable because, they want it to slow down as it lands. The ascent was not variable because you just want to go up. That is about 10,000 pounds. That's about half the thrust of a Harrier's VTOL engine. Half. And a Harrier does not leave a crater when it's hovering. We could get more into the physics and force necessary to move aside the ground, but I don't think we need to. 10,000 pounds is just not a lot of pounds. It's more than an average jet engine. That's true. Like a passenger jet engine has less than 10,000 pounds thrust per. But it is not throw boulders around, even close. It is not remotely close to throw boulders around level. It is not remotely close to dig a hole to bedrock. It's barely even moved the surface around. It's just this argument that it not producing a crater is in no way, shape, or form compelling when you actually look at the numbers and don't just think, well, 10,000, that's a big number.
Yeah, it does sound like a big number, but really in the scale of the things we're talking about, it's in comparison with, like you said, with the Saturn V rocket or with a Harrier engine, we have those things to compare it with, and none of those things even do what he's claiming that this lunar lander thrust rocket would do.
Yeah, they just don't. It's just no 10,000. It's just no. It's not a good argument.
Apparently, there was NASA's explanation for this, or at least for part of this, like the why it didn't kick up dust and all of that, was because most of the deceleration they had done in high orbit. So the deceleration maneuvers, meaning that like any hard burn or hard thrust they had to do was done way high up, wouldn't have disturbed the surface of the moon that much.
Okay, that's true. Now, I was focusing on the extreme end of the claim.
Sure.
And yeah, on the lighter end of the claim of it just wasn't throwing up much. Well, yeah, by the time they were landing, you don't want to smash the astronauts into the ground.
No.
I don't know if anyone listening has ever played Kerbal Space Program, but it's a great game. Yeah. Can you imagine if they just were going full bore when they hit the ground?
It wouldn't be good. They would have made for a very different show.
No, yeah. Okay.
Well, the reason I brought that up is because that's one of the things that our boy Nardwuar brings up to Bill Kaysing, NASA's explanation to kind of see what Bill's thoughts are on this.
What about the operation of the lunar module in the sense that it takes place thousands of miles above the moon? This is what NASA says. That, like, the operation, the big explosion that comes from the lunar module, when it lands on the moon, it happens, way up above the moon, and that's why there's no crater. What about that explanation?
Well, you know yourself that the lunar lander eventually had to, according to NASA, land on the moon. Well, as it approached the landing point, the engine still had to develop enough thrust to keep the lunar lander, which weighed in lunar gravity about 3,000 pounds. They had to develop enough thrust to keep it floating above the surface in order to let it gently land on the surface. But that obviously was not substantiated by any crater under the lunar lander engine.
It didn't hover. It just landed.
No, Carl had to hover.
Talking about it like it hovered.
It had to hover there first and then just slowly let itself down.
No, he didn't even answer Nardwar's question. Like, Nardwar very well said, like, they started high. They were, by the time they got down close to the surface, there wasn't much deceleration left. Because you don't want to decelerate a spacecraft quickly with astronauts in it.
Probably a bad idea.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Carl, I'm going to give this point to you and Nardwar because I don't think he answered that question very well either. So
3-0.
You guys both get a point. So let's move on to our next topic, and I'll let these guys introduce it for us. And Nardwar will recap.
Furthermore, the radiation should have turned your astronauts into crispy space bacon.
Yes, it would have, and it also would have pierced them with thousands of micrometeorites. The moon is not a place for human beings, ever.
Not a place for human beings, ever. Let's talk a little bit more about those micrometeorites.
Then you've got outer space, where there are billions of micrometeorites zipping around at speeds up to 60,000 miles per hour, and these would have gone right through the command capsule with the astronauts in it and kept right on going. And these micrometeorites are all different sizes, from the head of a pin to, say, the size of a grapefruit and larger.
Oh, what do you say about that, Carl? Micrometeorites flying through astronauts' ships and or heads.
Okay. Well, he got the speed right. They are going at about 60,000 kilometers an hour.
All right.
He did not get the size right, though. There are larger micrometeorites. There absolutely are. But when we say the word micrometeorite, I think it tends to evoke... I mean, very few of us have been to the moon. So what it's mostly going to evoke is what we see in movies. And what we see in movies is the size of micrometeorite that is actually a problem. And that is those larger ones, a quarter and up. A grapefruit would indeed be devastating. But as you get closer to a stellar body, they're just not going to be that common because gravity, the bigger it is, the more gravity is going to pull it in. And we'll get into this on the moon rocks, but the vast majority of micrometeorites, quote, is really just space dust. To call it even the head of a pin might be overselling the size. These are very small bits that are traveling very fast, so they do have to be dealt with. I mean, he's right. The moon is not a hospitable place. If it were, life would probably be there.
Already, yeah.
But, you're not going to want to go for a stroll, but because the prevailing micrometeorites are really just space dust and they're very tiny, they can be taken care of. In fact, for spacecraft, we already had the solution in 1946.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. Fred Whipple is the one who proposed the basics, and I think it's called a Whipple shield at this point.
I love that.
It
Whipple
still
shield.
exists on modern spacecraft, though it has changed over time. They've improved the materials it's made out of. One thing I've heard some conspiracy theorists claim is that the foil on the outside of the space capsule is something I've heard as evidence of, it's clearly not that advanced, it's just wrapped in foil. I don't know if this gentleman makes that claim. But in fact, there's a very specific reason for that. It's a extraordinarily light solution, and as we've mentioned, every ounce, every gram counts when you're going into space. And it is much more effective than having an ablative layer. So an ablative shield is a shield that is designed to be destroyed. As impacts occur, it starts to get carved away. Were we talking about building some sort of interstellar spacecraft, we would almost certainly, based on our current technology, want to go with some kind of ablative shielding, because it's a big rock and you just let it get pocked. But ablative shielding is big, it's heavy. We use ablative heat shields to return into the atmosphere on the capsules. They're designed to burn away. But that's not the most practical way. That's not the lightest way to handle this problem. Instead, you use this foil. If anyone has ever thrown a baseball at a sheet or done something similar, you know the basic concept behind the Whipple shield. It is made to it's a layer that is suspended away from the hard structure of the spacecraft. That largely means you basically don't even need structural shielding to account for these things. Because as these tiny, tiny, tiny particles hit the foil, it moves. It can absorb all of their kinetic energy. They are so small and moving so fast that they're essentially annihilated into plasma on collision. And the gap between, I almost said air gap, but it's a vacuum, so it's not an air gap, which is actually even better for the shield, is wide enough between the Whipple shield and the structure of the craft that the plasma just dissipates before it hits anything. So you've got this shield that can absorb up to impacts much larger than the normal space dust that it's going to be hitting, and it just hits the foil and goes away. The foil itself, I keep calling it foil, but it's not like it was just aluminum foil. It's like I think it's like a polyethylene. Modern Whipple shields are made out of Kevlar and ceramic laced fabrics. They can absorb much larger impacts too. So yeah, I mean, that's just, you can take care of it. As with so many other dangers, he is severely overstating the prevalence of the actual dangerous things. Now, like if an asteroid field had come by, or like what do they call groups of asteroids?
Asteroid field, I thought. I thought that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. But like if our orbit was taking us through an asteroid field at that time, then yeah, there could be danger of a lot bigger rocks, a lot larger rocks. But we're not going to plan a short-term moon mission when we're going to be passing through an asteroid field. And if we were planning more long-term occupation, we would build accordingly. Mm-hmm. So he's overstating the danger and understating our ability to counter it. Now, that explains the spacecraft, but what about the suits? Well, for the suits, they all have on them what is called a thermal micrometeorite garment layer. It is the layer that takes care of, and we'll get into this, I think, in the next part, but temperature is handled by that, as well as the micrometeorites. It insulates against heat loss, it blocks out solar radiation, and it fends off the actual common micrometeorite space debris. The modern TMG is different, but for the Apollo missions and for Skylab, it was a neoprene-coated nylon ripstop. That's a woven nylon fabric coated in synthetic rubber. There were 5 layers of mylar. In addition to that, 5 layers of mylar alternated with a non-woven dacron, which is just another polymer fabric, with an outer layer of a Teflon-coated non-flammable filament beta cloth, which was intended to protect from just abrasion from the lunar dust. Lunar dust is actually very, very abrasive. In fact, that poses a greater danger than the majority of space dust, because that does require some ablation to take care of it on everything from tools to spacesuits to tires on the rover to whatever.
Awesome.
And
that's interesting.
So he is overstating the danger, overstating the presence of the larger objects in proximity to something that has as much gravity as the moon. Not that the moon has a lot of gravity compared to Earth anyway. And he is understating our ability to account for that. Now, had a grapefruit micrometeorite come through, it would have fucked up everything. But, again, they're not that common, and we can account for a lot.
So good planning and actually preparing and defending against these sort of hazards beforehand, not just sending up a bunch of astronauts up there with windbreakers and Mountain Dew.
This wasn't like four 14-year-olds planning to go hike through the forest who'd never been on a hike before, and they go running out in their sandals and ripped jean shorts and like a t-shirt with like one bottle of water between them. This was like the people who've been camping for 20 years and climbing for 20 years and decide to mount an expedition up K2.
Yeah. They kind of know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As much as anyone can.
Right.
The first time they go somewhere like the moon.
Gosh, Carl, that was very informative, and I think I'm gonna have to give you another point on this one. Bill is not doing great here. We are 0-4 for Bill Casing.
Could have predicted that reality would beat fiction in a debate about reality?
I certainly had no idea. All right. Well, all right. So you've debunked the whole no stars in the photographs. We've talked about why the radiation isn't as big of a deal as he's saying it is.
At least why it's one we can account for.
Right. We talked about how we accounted for the lack of craters on the moon. We talked about how we dealt with the potential hazard of micrometeorites. What about the point, Carl, that it's just too dang hot on the moon?
The temperature on the moon during the lunar day is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, trying to keep either the suits or the lunar lander cool during that tremendous heat from a blazing sun would have been impossible because they did not have enough air conditioning power.
You heard that right, Carl. Not enough air conditioning power.
Okay. All right. So I didn't think to check that. They probably didn't have enough power to cool something down from 250 degrees. That's probably correct. The moon also gets to about negative 280 degrees Fahrenheit when it's the middle of the lunar night. But there's a solution to that. It's not 250 degrees at dawn, and it's not 280 degrees at dawn or sunset. And so, again, planning. You just plan your spacewalks to not occur when the most hostile conditions are happening. Also, I don't know if Bill's aware of this, but there were sensors inside the rocket engines, and they get way hotter. We can insulate stuff, right? We've had ovens for a long time. We've insulated things for a long time. So you also just make sure your equipment never gets up to 250 degrees and never gets down to 280. You insulate it. They had active cooling and heating in the spacesuits. They had the thermal micrometeorite garment layer that I mentioned, which was a major insulator. The suits themselves were covered in that white color that was also to reflect solar radiation. Also, most of the ways that we're familiar with heating up and cooling down are made specifically possible because there's an air surrounding us. When we get hot, we sweat, that sweat evaporates, that evaporation causes cooling, right? There is no atmosphere on the moon. The only way heat is transferred is by light from the sun, solar radiation hitting the suits, and a very limited amount of heat transfer between the boot and the ground. But the regolith covering the moon is it's dusty, it's not compacted because no one walks there. And so there's just not that much heat. It's not ideal for heat transfer anyway. And then you insulate it to keep your heat in, and you have active cooling to keep the temperature from getting up too much. and you have the layers to prevent heat from escaping when you need it, and you have the layers to bounce as much solar radiation back as possible. Spacesuits, even at the Apollo/Skylab suits, could already reflect 90% of all solar radiation to prevent heating, and we've only gotten better. Equipment also, again, is just insulated, so you're not operating at 250 or negative 280. You don't go outside when it's those temperatures, and you just keep things actively heated and cooled so that they never get that hot, and you're not trying to contend with the extremes anyway. I mean, he's right. Mm-hmm. If you let that suit get up to 250, it was not going to work, but you don't.
Yeah. Again, another example of taking the extreme and calling it the norm.
Yeah. And again, he's bringing up things that we will have to worry about if we intend to create long-term habitation on the moon, which here's hoping that happens in our lifetime, but not for a few days.
Yeah. All right. Well, I give you 0.52, buddy. You
reality wins again.
You pulled out the flaw in his logic there. So, all right. I guess we have no choice but to let our good friend Nardwar recap where we're at and introduce our next topic.
So continuing on with reasons that we didn't make it to the moon here, Bill Kaysing is pointing out there were no stars in the photos from the moon. There was no crater beneath the lunar lander. The radiation should have cooked people. There were various lighting anomalies.
Oh, a lot of lighting anomalies.
Anomalaries, Carl.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. You want to let's
fascinating.
Let's hear a little bit more about that.
Some friends from Europe came over recently, and what they did, they're very interested in this project. They analyzed NASA films of supposedly taken on the moon, frame by frame.
They're European.
And you know what they found out?
What, Bill Kaysing? We never went to the moon.
Shadows diverged. In other words, if you have a point source of light like the sun, and you can see this anytime outdoors, all shadows will be parallel. Telephone poles, trees, you name it, all the shadows will be parallel. Well, these men found in analyzing frame-by-frame movies that there was more than one lighting source for this film.
Wow, Carl. Multiple lighting sources had to have been lit from different sources because of the different lengths and different directions the shadows of the astronauts and the lunar equipment cast on the moon.
Okay, so again, this one is based in a thing that's true. If you have a flat plane and a light source far enough away, which the sun is absolutely far enough away, you will have parallel shadows. On a flat plane, when observed from above, you will have parallel shadows. But the moon is not a flat plane, and these pictures aren't observing from above. So all Bill seems to have discovered is something that most children discover when they take their first art class and learn about drawing the vanishing point, which is that as things move away from you, they will appear to converge. There's also, he claims there's multiple sources of light. If there were multiple sources of light, there would also be multiple shadows, and there aren't, because there aren't multiple sources of light. So we wouldn't just have shadows that were going in weird angles. We would have multiple lines of parallel shadows that were going in different angles, which is not the case.
Right.
And so that debunks multiple sources of light. There's one source of light. The surface of the moon is also, again, we can see it in the night sky. We can observe from the Earth that it is very reflective and bright. So that messes with the way shadows work a little bit. And the surface is very uneven. We actually have a few pictures, which, fingers crossed, Michael will be able to throw up here, that show when it may look parallel from above, but then when you go down, if one of those shadows goes down a hill and you're looking at it from the side, it might appear that it's not moving parallel, but instead coming towards you. or away from you, depending on the slope of the hill. So all they're seeing is just that there's an uneven surface with a light source very, 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 very far away, and the optical illusion created by taking a 3D image onto the 2D plane of a photograph that then makes it appear as though these shadows are moving in different angles, when that just isn't the case. And anyone who claims that there's really studio lighting and multiple sources of light, that claim is beyond easily debunked, because multiple sources of light would have generated multiple shadows, which I didn't hear him claim. So I'm not sure how he thinks that they're only casting a shadow from one of the lights, but I would imagine he doesn't address that.
No, that doesn't get brought up in this discussion. Yeah, and that was one of the things that stood out to me the most about that point, was just like, if you have multiple light sources, you have multiple shadows. Like it's everyone that's ever been lit by more than one light knows this. That's paid any sort of attention.
Well, and I would hope you don't even have to know that. You should just be able to think, light casts shadows. Where's the other shadow?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, anyone who's seen a shadow go down a mountain knows that it looks like that shadow's coming towards you, but it's not. That's just the shadow being cast down across a slope that does bend towards you, but not the shadow.
Right. Well, let's see what our boy Bill Casing has to say about that explanation.
Well, how about NASA countering that, where they say, on some pictures, astronauts are lit from more than one side because the sunlight is reflected off the lunar surface or off the lunar vehicle?
Very unlikely in a vacuum, because light doesn't go around corners unless it's assisted. If you look at NASA pictures allegedly taken on the moon, all of the potholes, the little mini craters and so forth, have completely black shadows. Well, any picture of any device on the moon should have had completely black shadows where the sun did not illuminate them.
What?
Yep. I think part of this is there's a piece of there's one picture that's famous that there is a plate that is, or like there's a plaque or something like that you can read even though that's in shadow, that's partially illuminated. That's one conspiracy theory, was that, it's obviously lit from multiple sides because it's in shadow, so I shouldn't be able to read it. It should be completely black.
Well, they also really, really, really took extraordinarily detailed photos with specifically designed cameras and developed them at extraordinarily high contrast.
Yeah.
That's not compelling. I don't... Light doesn't go around corners... Light doesn't go around corners not in a vacuum either. It just bounces off stuff.
I'm finding his explanations to be somewhat lacking. I mean, he says them so confidently, and he says things that are sometimes true, like light doesn't go around corners unless it's assisted. Like, okay.
Yeah, like with a prism or something that refracts it, sure.
Yeah, and it bounces off.
In a vacuum, there's not going to be anything to refract it other than a spaceship or the surface of the moon or the spacesuits that reflected 90% of all solar radiation.
Or the planet Earth, kind of right there.
Does he think mirrors don't work in space?
I don't know.
It sounds like he thinks mirrors don't work in space. Maybe that's why vampires don't have reflections, because they're really in space.
Space vampires.
Vampires are a vacuum.
Vampires are a vacuum. Oh no. All right. Well, I'm sorry to Bill. I'm gonna give Carl another one. That's 6 points for you now, buddy. Doing pretty good here. Let's see if you can take another one on.
All right.
Here.
Wait. Yeah. I'll tell you what. I am going to wager all of the points I have so far on these next two.
Ooh. We're doing a double Jeopardy. All right, he's wagering.
Double Jeopardy twice.
Double Jeopardy.
Quadruple Jeopardy.
Quadruple Jeopardy. All right. Let's see how you fare against this next cerebral 4D chess brain counterpoint from Bill Casing.
Now, another point here is the moon rocks were fake. Like, are the moon rocks real?
No, they are not real. NASA has a well-developed ceramics laboratory with high-temperature ovens.
So that's another way NASA could prove they went to the moon, because they brought back these rocks.
Yeah,
Interestingly enough, at the University of British Columbia here, David Strangway, the president of the University of British Columbia, was the guy in charge of inspecting the moon rocks.
Okay, fine. Why don't you call him up and ask him what he thinks about them?
So what happened? The moon rocks were not real?
No, they were manufactured on Earth to look like moon rocks. But since nobody has any moon rocks to compare them with, it's very simple to make up a moon rock and say, hey, this came from the
moon. This came from the moon, Carl. Look, I just made this moon rock. I just stuck my finger in my nose, and out came this moon rock that I pulled from space.
All right. NASA does, in fact, have ceramics laboratories. Very advanced ones. Ceramics are part of the manufacture of spacecraft. They're a big part, because you can do all sorts of crazy, very light, strong things with ceramics. So I will not dispute the existence of NASA's ceramics laboratory, nor am I willing to... Okay, I am going to outline how we know the moon rocks are real. If his contention would be that NASA actually possesses a magic ceramics laboratory that could somehow falsely create all of these conditions, I am unwilling to engage with that.
All right, well, let's see what you got, and then we'll see what Bill's got.
So I would also note that the moon rocks, even as of 1996, when this interview was occurring, are primarily still held at NASA. That is true. But samples have been sent out around the world. They've been examined by literally thousands and thousands of scientists. It is very difficult for me to believe that amongst all of these thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists, that they would have been, none of them would have been able to note the markers that the moon rocks weren't real, because of the many ways we know that they are. Any attempt, this is a quote from Trevor Ireland of the Australian National University. Dr. Ireland says that any attempt to make moon rocks in a laboratory would be a monumental failure and likely cost more money than it took NASA to get to the moon and back.
Jesus.
Yeah. He goes on further to state that, quote, the lunar soil is like nothing we have seen before on Earth. It is the result of eons of bombardment on the surface of the moon. The rocks have compositions that are unique to the moon. This same man, who seems to overstate the danger of micrometeorites, is completely ignoring the fact that one of the big ways that we know that the moon rocks are moon rocks is because of the thousands and thousands and thousands of years of being bombarded at 60 kilometers a second by space dust, and the incredibly notable pockmarks, nearly impossible to, like, the layers of solar radiation that have bombarded these things make it unfathomable to imitate. The moon rocks are identifiable for many of the same reasons that conspiracists claim that the moon landing is impossible. In fact, there was a Dutch museum in 2009 who had what they had claimed, it was the prized possession of this museum, and it was a moon rock. And it wasn't real. It wasn't a real moon rock. And we were able to determine that for the way that we know moon rocks are moon rocks.
Because we brought some back from the moon.
Yeah, a doctor... I would also like to note that these things have also been examined by scientists the world over, working for national laboratories of many other countries, including U.S. rivals, who easily would be able to prove that the U.S. had falsified the moon landing. And what incentive do they have to support a U.S. government effort to create this generations-long propaganda campaign? Further, the Dr. Mark Norman, a lunar geologist at the University of Tasmania, says that lunar samples have almost no water trapped in their crystalline structure, and common substances such as clay minerals that are ubiquitous on Earth are totally absent in moon rocks. we found particles of fresh glass in moon rocks that were produced by explosive volcanic activity and by meteorite impacts over 3 billion years ago. The presence of water on Earth rapidly breaks down such volcanic glass in only a few million years. These rocks have to have come from the moon. Apollo rocks are further peppered with, as we mentioned, tiny craters from meteorite impacts. So we know from their surface and the tiny craters from the micrometeorite and solar dust and space dust impacts. We know from their actual chemical structure. We know from dating the glass. They mentioned they dated the glass back to 3 billion years ago. The titanic task of trying to fake that is not within modern ceramic technology, much less in the late 60s, 70s, or 90s. So, as I said, Bill Casing claims they have this amazing ceramics laboratory that can somehow accomplish that. Bill Casing needs to show me some evidence that ceramics have advanced that far by 1996, or he's engaging in magical thinking, and that is not a claim worth trying to dispute.
Well, you would say that, Carl, because you're a smart guy that looks into things and is critical of conspiracy theories and doesn't, take what the theorists say on just their foundational level. But have you?
Thanks for getting water up my nose.
Have you? Have you ever considered Bill's point here?
Well, how would you know it is a moon rock?
Well, there's...
like, how do you know it's not a moon rock? Like, how do you know it's a fake?
I had a Seattle geologist who examined moon rocks, and he said there's no question, Bill, that these rocks were made in a laboratory on Earth.
So some guy in Seattle said there's no question.
I will give him this. That guy in Seattle sounds just as qualified as his European friends who looked at the footage. That's some serious bona fides of anonymous geologist in Seattle.
Yeah. He said there was no way they came from the moon, Carl, so...
The anonymous geologist in Seattle that Bill totally didn't make up. He's probably friends with Alex Jones colonels.
He's all the colonels, lieutenant colonels that Alex Jones
Lieutenant
hangs
colonels,
out with.
I'm sorry.
Lieutenant colonels. Well, not full-blown colonels. Gosh, I don't know. That was a little bit convincing on Bill's part. No.
Oh, and it's double jeopardy. Oh.
It's double jeopardy too. You know what, Carl? I'm still gonna give you the win on that one.
Tell you what, since he was a little confusing, let's let it ride through to the next point.
All right, we're letting it ride.
Yeah.
Quadruple jeopardy coming in to our 8th and final point here. Okay, so we've gone over about 7 different points that you've now refuted. Scientist and author Bill Casing's assertions that we did not land on the moon and it was impossible because of these
scientist.
Because of these 7 things. Let's get on to the last point that he brings up here. And this is a conspiracy theory / and this is the one that I think everybody's familiar with. This is the idea that, well, you know what? Let's let our friend Nardwar introduce this concept a little bit. He's Canadian, and so, of course, he wants to know Canadian stuff.
Are there any Canadian connections to the moon landing? You mentioned Quebec looking a lot like the moon, and perhaps some photos were taken there to help fake the moon landing.
Yes, I was told that there's an area north of Quebec that's very rocky and very austere. There's no vegetation, and that some of the astronauts were seen in that vicinity. And it's possible that they were trying to take lunar shots north of Quebec.
Aha. So, we're introducing the idea that the moon landing is all theater, all produced in a studio. We touched on it a little bit with the divergent lighting, but this is the crux of what not everybody, but way too many people believe.
Practice in pools and deserts and all sorts of other places that try to get as close as possible to the conditions that we can't actually emulate on Earth so that they don't panic when they're in freaking space.
Panicking in space is a bad thing.
Yeah.
Hot take. Well, if this moon landing was fake, Carl, let's discuss some options about where we think it may have been filmed.
they could have done it in the Nevada desert in an area called 51, which is the northeast corner of the Atomic Energy Commission base there.
They have a lot of UFO stuff going on around Area 51, don't they?
Yeah. 51 is a place where you don't want to be found at all. All the guards carry submachine guns, and they are told to shoot to kill if anybody gets inside the base.
Goodness. Sounds like this area number 51 is a pretty scary place, Carl. I don't know if I'd ever want to go there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, presuming that Area 51 is where they filmed it, why hasn't anybody ever seen where we've seen it? Let's let Nardwuar be a little skeptical here.
Bill, has anybody ever seen the studio that this was faked in, where they faked the moon landing? Has anybody ever seen the studio where they faked it? Because, like, it's in Area 51, which you alluded to. It was also alluded to in the films Diamonds Are Forever and Capricorn 1.
Yes, that's right. They did allude to the sound stage or the hidden moon set. No, the reason no one has ever seen it and come out alive is because they don't intend for anybody to see it and come out alive. You got to remember that NASA is kind of a lethal organization. Jim Irwin, Apollo 15, was put up to blowing the whistle on the whole project, and he called me up ostensibly to give me the facts. 4 days later, he died of a heart attack. Now, what does that tell you?
What does that tell you, Carl?
That Bill's a liar.
Some guy was about to spill the beans, but he had a heart attack because Area 51 soundstage?
Mike Flynn believes in QAnon, so sure, maybe there was a NASA guy that fell for all this nonsense.
Fair enough.
Sure.
Let me let Bill have one more point in edgewise here.
Okay, all right.
And all this was faked somewhere in the desert.
Well, either in the desert and or Norton Air Force Base. I suspect that a lot of the real fine photography and action was done at Norton Air Force Base, where they were able to create what appeared to be solar lighting. That was one of the most difficult things to do, to simulate the sun, because the sun's light is so glaring, so powerful, that it would have taken a tremendous arc lamp to simulate the sun. And they could have actually created a vacuum inside the soundstage. See, if you've got $30 billion, it's no problem to do just about anything you want, including murder people.
Go to the moon?
I'm just going to let that last part slide right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had a lot of money. They had to build a giant sound studio. They had to
apparently that they kept in vacuum.
They could have put it in a vacuum. They had a big giant sound stage. They had crazy lighting, some for multiple angles potentially, but maybe not. Bill's bringing some compelling discussion points here, Carl. What do you got to say to all that?
Okay, so they also launched the rockets, though. I mean, even if they did this fake, that means they also, parallel to the fake, launched rockets. Because Apollo 11, for example, was the most viewed television broadcast in history until the landing itself. But that was the broadcast. With their own eyes, roughly 1 million people were able to see the Apollo 11 rocket go up into space. So the rocket definitely was launched. Bill may not believe there were people in it, but the rocket was launched.
All right. So, you know what? We're going to do a point and counterpoint thing here. I think because we have Bill Casing talking about that very specific point. So, let's see what Bill has to say.
Did people see Apollo 11 take off?
Well, yes, certainly.
So what happened? What happened then? If they saw it take off, what happened? Like the rocket took off, what happened, Bill Casing? If we didn't go to the moon, what actually happened when Apollo 11 took off?
The Apollo 11 vehicle, or Saturn V, was sent out of people's sight, and then it was jettisoned into the South Atlantic, where all of the 6 that were launched now reside. There were no astronauts, of course, on board. They were hidden away carefully to be returned, allegedly, in their command capsule by being dumped out of a C-5A transport plane.
All right. That's Okay. I mean, like, the only thing I can say to that is that, I mean, if they took it out of sight and then jettisoned it, I guess the million people may not have been able to see that. The weather conditions were extraordinarily clear, but that's not disprovable beyond your general, like, that would have taken a lot of people would have needed to be involved in that. There are a lot of people that watched the space launch. There are a lot of amateur astronomers the world over that watched the parts fall, and I can say that someone surely would have spotted that, but he's proposing the little man in the fridge, so I don't think I can really. Well, I don't concede the point, but I'm not willing to engage with something disprovable beyond your general. Lots of people when it would have been involved, and someone probably would have talked.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Carl? And somebody apparently did witness this.
Was it his friend from Europe?
So you talked to a pilot who saw all this happen?
Yes, a pilot came on the air when I was doing a broadcast just like this one, and he says, Bill, I agree with you 100%. He says, I was flying from San Francisco to Tokyo, and I saw, along with several passengers, I saw a command capsule dropped out of a C-5A, and the red and white candy-striped parachutes opened, and it descended to the surface of the ocean.
Ah, so some guy that called into a radio show that happened to be piloting a plane to Tokyo.
Why in God's name would they have done that anywhere near commercial airline
commercial
routes?
airline flats? Yeah. I mean, even if that story was true, even if that story was not just, it's some random fucking guy calling into a radio show that he's on,
yeah,
and saying, I agree with you,
proof
I totally saw it.
That he's even a pilot. And even if he saw something, he could have seen test drops. They did drop them out of planes to test them.
Of course.
Like, there's all sorts of things he could have seen. And if they were faking this, why would they have done it anywhere near any sort of registered flight path? That's absurd.
It seems very dangerous.
That is ridiculous on its face. Now, there are, though. Does Bill have any other ideas that prove that this was filmed?
You know, Bill, he does, but I think we'll go ahead and let you respond to that before we let Bill have another word in.
So, I will say the idea of building a gigantic vacuum chamber soundstage is stupid. That's just stupid.
I thought you were going to say awesome, but yeah.
Yeah, awesome, but logistically stupid.
Yeah, fair.
Like, no, that's just no. I wonder what the largest vacuum chamber is.
I was just going to go look that up.
I
looked it up the other day because they were looking at trying to fly
100 feet in diameter and 122 feet tall. That's
pretty big.
Dang big.
That's pretty
big.
Yeah.
That's not fake the moon landing soundstage big, though.
No.
But that's pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty big. And when was it constructed, though? 2010.
So, not 1969.
No.
Ah.
No.
Hmm.
And it does not look like the moon. It's a big metal cylinder.
Is it a cylinder or a sphere?
I mean, they might have flooring in it to make it change the shape, but the picture I'm looking at is of a cylinder.
Okay.
So it was built for testing the Orion craft.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
So no, that's just no. But there's some other issues too. One, he claims that the lighting was so difficult, and yet I guess it's still one of the reasons they know it's fake. So these are internally contradictory to his own fake moon landing mythos. And I don't have a counterpoint to that. I would just like to point out the internal contradiction to his own narrative. There's a big problem, though, with this, which is that they were in low gravity, and like wire systems and kerning to take that out didn't exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've heard proposed, and Bill may also, that they just slowed the footage down. Maybe it was filmed at full speed and they slowed the footage down. The camera that was used in the moon landing filmed at 10 frames per second, that's a low frame rate, right? And that is at times used, I know, as credence to the idea that it was really a much faster camera that they slowed down. But that doesn't hold up well at all. For one thing, the idea that it slowed down, there exists footage of there's a footage of the moon lander driving along, and it bounces down slowly, but the astronauts' fingers and hands are still moving at full speed. So that is a strong evidence against slowing the footage down alone.
That's a tough one.
But there is a much more important and much more practical reason why this is simply not possible. In 1969, there exist two ways to take overcranked footage and slow it down. That is, filming at a higher frame rate and then slowing it down to give that false impression.
Okay.
You could either do it with film, or we did have some magnetic storage discs at the time. That's actually the method that was used in the cameras. They were digital cameras recording to magnetic tapes. So for younger listener, like we'll ever get one, we used to have these things called tapes that recorded onto magnetic strips. And even though that wasn't a modern digital camera, it still was digital, not analog, like onto film. Film, they would have had to, build a completely custom camera that would have worked in multiples of 10 and run completely contradictory, and they would have had to then make different kind of film that would work in that, which just adds a lot more people. So it seems like film's unlikely already. In addition to that, the footage of the moon landing is 47 minutes long. To film that you probably have to film it at around 3 times speed to slow it down.
Okay.
A typical 35 millimeter reel of film operates at 24 frames per second and only lasts 11 minutes. And that 11 minutes of film at 24 frames per second is 1,000 feet long.
That's long.
To get that down to 12 frames a second, which is as close as we can get to the 10, you would need 143 minutes of film footage. That would be 6.5 reels of film that would then need to be spliced together and developed perfectly. Because there are no artifacts in the footage. There's no hairs, no dust, no breaks, no nothing. The idea that you could perfectly develop and splice 6,500 feet of film, that is 1.25 miles of film, is on its face silly. That's just logistically extraordinarily difficult. It's incredibly unlikely that they would have been able to pull that off. It is nearly certain. I mean, and I guess Bill could say, well, they just did it perfect. And it's like, all right, fine. But no. So that makes it much more likely that they would have had to use the digital solution, as was stated in the specs of the camera, that actually went to the moon and filmed at 10 frames a second. Now, that would mean much more simple, too, to overcrank and undercrank digital. You just go faster or slower. So you could just film it at 30 seconds. And so you just film 143 minutes and crank it down to 47 minutes. And you might say, well, of course you could do that. I can do that with my phone. But you couldn't do that with your phone in 1969. In fact, our digital storage medium alone poses a problem here. In 1969, the largest digital storage medium that they would have used to take this footage and over and undercrank it could only hold 30 seconds of footage, which would be 90 seconds of playback. So to get the 143 minutes of footage all in one chain slowed down, that would have required a storage medium 286 times the largest known storage medium, the largest available. Now, maybe Bill would say, well, they're the government, and they have $30 million.
$30 billion.
Oh, yeah, sorry. That is an important distinction. And they had $30 billion. So somehow they managed to get this storage medium that there was no conceivable knowledge of, and no one who knew anything about digital storage mediums knew anything that could have produced anything like that. but they're the government and they had $30 billion, so they just could do it. But that's stupid. That's stupid. You're now adding too many things. You're developing things that you cannot possibly have any kind of evidence to show, because someone somewhere would have known that someone had cracked something that increased storage capacity by 286 times. So just alone, the technology to film and slow that down, or to put people on wires and special effects those wires out, just simply did not exist in 1969 when the moon landing happened. And everything else aside, all of these other dangers, all of his weird crap about lights and the magic lights that come from different angles but don't make multiple shadows, when it gets down to this, nothing else matters, because we couldn't have faked the filming, because the technology to do so, to store the footage and then slow it down, simply did not exist in 1969.
Well, damn it, man. That's compelling too. That was a real good smart guy explanation about why that's a little bit unlikely. Something that we haven't been talking about in this whole discussion, it's been somewhat absent from our point and counterpoint nature of this podcast. It's been discussion about the astronauts themselves and the real human toll that covering up a hoax like this really takes on someone. So I want to just take a short little diversion to listen to what Bill has to say about the astronauts on the Apollo program.
They were, of course, picked up and put into biological suits so that they wouldn't afflict anybody with moon germs. But my theory on that is that they couldn't tell these big bald-faced lies this early. So they were actually kept from the press for approximately a month until they could sort of reconcile themselves with telling a lot of big lies.
It's hard for astronauts to lie, Carl. They go through a lot of training.
Why didn't they just... They were faking the moon landing. They didn't really send them to space. Why wasn't part of that whole process getting them ready to lie?
I know. It just seems like that's something that they should have really been trained for, but they were just trained for,
pretending to go to
the moon. They didn't think about having to train them how to lie about
standing in a film studio? What?
Well,
this doesn't even make sense.
Carl, I'm going to go ahead and give this last point to you two. And you know what? Even though I'm convinced by your smart guy antics, I think we haven't really quite convinced Bill Casing yet. By the way, Bill Casing passed away in 2005. Rest in peace.
No, but I'm just curious. Apollo 11 takes off. The rocket dumps in the off South America, off the Atlantic there. Then what happens then? Are the astronauts just hiding somewhere, and then eventually they get on a plane and then jump out of the plane and they've landed? That was it?
That is correct.
No moon involved at all.
No moon involved at all. I am 100% positive of this, and every day when I get information from people that support my views, I'm more convinced than ever.
Shoot for the stars, Bill.
Every day when I get information from people that support my views, I'm more convinced than ever.
That was the most confirmation biasy statement I've ever heard someone say out loud.
When I heard that line, I was like, this interview is gonna take a turn. Something is gonna happen here, and it's gonna be magnificent. Carl, man, you did a great job looking and researching and all those things. All I had to do was cut a bunch of clips and listen to Bill Casing talk about a crazy nonsense for hours on end.
Well, I have enjoyed this wild ride, Mike.
Oh boy, buddy, just wait. So I think this is going to be our first ever 2-part episode.
Milestone.
Yeah, we're going to have to do this as 2 parts because this is too good. I'm going to tease a little bit.
We were just talking about cutting it down to an hour.
We were, and now here we are at 2 again. We're going to go more, but you might have guessed there's been a few hints dropped along the way that there might be more going on with Bill than meets the surface, or at least that one can find on his Wikipedia page. And so in our next episode, we're going to take a little bit deeper look at who Bill Casing is and what might be motivating him and why he started putting out this book and why he started propagating these theories about the moon landing being a hoax. Turns out there's some interesting stuff behind that. So
I'm so ready.
before we go, we're gonna finish off with the smart guy stuff. I want to give you one more of these, and I didn't add this into the counterpoint, but this shows you kind of the level that these conspiracy theorists are working on. And I just have to say, one, I haven't talked about it enough yet, but the more and more I listen to this interview, the more I just fall in love with Nardwuar. Like, this guy is the geekiest sounding, funniest looking dude that I think I've ever seen. And yet, like, I find myself listening to his questions and I'm like, that's a good question. Like, he's asking it in a ridiculously silly, geeky way, but he's holding Bill's feet to the fire a little bit on this.
Oh, he did his prep work for this interview.
It was not what I was expecting, and it just gets even crazier from here. So on our way out, I will give you one more bonus counterpoint from Bill Casing, and I'll let Nardwuar explain it.
The actual astronauts had strange language as well. I noticed from your book there were some little clips and also some other articles like Houston Control said, well, it's a good show. And in the command service module replied, fantastic. And then Armstrong replied, yeah, I'll second that. Like, well, it's a good show. That was interesting language.
Yeah, interesting language. Why would they say that if they weren't filming it in a soundstage, Carl?
Because they were filming it, but not in a soundstage?
Do you want to listen to the actual audio?
Sure.
All right.
Roger, we ring you 5 by Columbia. He has landed Tranquility Base. Eagle is at Tranquility, over. Yeah, I heard the whole thing. Well, good show. Fantastic.
Yeah. Buzz, good show. You landed the fucking lunar module on the moon. Good show.
Good show.
Good show, dude.
Yeah,
yeah. Bill Casing put that in his book as proof that we didn't land on the moon, because boy, that sure is funny language those astronauts are using. But you know, I just want to hear that.
No, it's not.
I want to hear that one more time.
Roger, we ring you 5 by Columbia. He has landed Tranquility Base. Eagle is at Tranquility, over. Yeah, I heard the whole thing. Well, good show. Fantastic.
There we are.
That's not even that anachronistic. We still use that term to tell people they did a good job.
Uh-huh.
Like,
good show.
Now, in 2021, that is a phrase that is still used. It was definitely still used in 1976 when he wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. And I would argue they even used it in 1996. You know what, Carl? Let's go ahead and leave it there. Let's go ahead and build ourselves up to part 2, where we're going to learn some more craziness about Bill Casing. And you are going to get to go on just a super fun ride to where this interview goes. Oh, man.
My body is ready.
All right, buddy. Do you have any final thoughts on this before we get out of this first part 1 episode?
No, I don't. Thank you for taking me on this journey, and I hope our listener enjoyed it as much as I did.
Oh, if you enjoyed the fun technical explanations that Carl gave, just get ready to have your brain just melted out of your head for the next part of this, because we are getting back into the fun conspiracy world of the pre-internet days of the 90s. So can't wait to dive you into this, buddy.
Can't wait. All right. Thanks, everybody. This was a podcast.
Yes, it was.